Welcome to this brief lecture on Beowulf, the epic tradition, and the English language. To begin with, we should talk about what's an epic in general. We should know the basics of the genre. Some of you have no doubt read epics such as the Iliad and the Odyssey. You can consider some parts of the Old Testament certainly epic-like. Gilgamesh is the earliest epic we have from the ancient Sumerian tradition. There are epics from other places, other cultures. All epics originate in the oral tradition. What is the oral tradition? A word you should know. Writing emerges about 4,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago. So how did humans communicate before that? How did they pass down their laws, their traditions, their stories, their family histories? It was all oral, and including poetry and their great stories. Someone eventually, a great poet, will decide to write down an epic. They will eventually put it down on paper, as it were. Homer, most famously in the Iliad and the Odyssey. We don't know if Homer actually existed. He's a name that has always been attributed to the Iliad and Odyssey. Some people are skeptical that there was a man named Homer who was blind who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. We don't know the author of Beowulf, Gilgamesh. Most epics we don't know the author of. It's simply too long ago. I do want you to know the difference between a primary epic and a secondary epic. A primary epic is an epic that emerges in the oral tradition, such as Gilgamesh, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and Beowulf, versus the secondary epic in which the author sits down and intentionally composes an epic, such as the Canterbury Tales, Dante's Divine Comedy, Milton's Paradise Lost, and, say, more recently, Star Wars. These are intentional epics, if you will. And it's good to know the difference between those two. They're very different in nature and characteristics. Speaking of characteristics, these are the fundamental characteristics of a primary epic. One, most begin with an evocation of the muse. The poet appeals to the muse to help him or her compose this great poem, or in the case of the poet who's chanting a chant the great poem. Oddly, Beowulf does not begin with an evocation to the muse. The first word of Beowulf is "what," which in Old English means "so" or "listen up, I have a story to tell." You can expect to see the celebration of a nation or a people. In the case of Gilgamesh, the ancient Sumerians. In the case of the Iliad and the Odyssey, of course, the ancient Greeks, who didn't refer to themselves as Greeks because there was no Greece as such. Beowulf, of course, the Scandinavian peoples, and so forth and so on. You can expect to see a celebration of heroic behavior versus unbecoming behavior. And sometimes sometimes the hero doesn't behave heroically. For example, Odysseus, when he returns to Ithaca, Gilgamesh sort of begins as a really ill-behaved young man, but they come of age. So in this respect, we'll see the emergence of heroes in an epic. You will find long descriptions of landscapes, of dress, of architecture, geography, and sometimes we refer to these as epic catalogs. There are other characteristics, but these are the main ones. So what makes Beowulf an epic? Most of the traits we already discussed. As I said, Beowulf emerges from the oral tradition in Scandinavia. Poetically, Beowulf conforms to meter and rhythm designed for memory and chanting. You'll hear and see some of that in the modern translation. I'll bring in the Old English as well as some manuscripts and read it, and you'll hear it more distinctly there. But it's most definitely composed for sitting around the fire and the poet, the shop, C-E-O-P, the shop, chanting this poem. It's the story of a nation, a tribe, a close-knit clan, whatever you want to refer to the Geats. It looks like it's pronounced Geats, but it's Geats. And of a hero, Beowulf, obviously, who seeks to show his mettle. It features two fearsome monsters that must be vanquished. Sorry about that. So let's correct that. And actually, I should correct this here at 3. Grendel, his mother, and, in the end, a dragon. It examines social codes, heroic codes, gender codes, and it is unapologetically bold and brash. Beowulf is what it is, an epic about a hero who kills monsters and saves people. But of course, it's much, much more complex and interesting than just that. So a brief summary of Beowulf. Again, we are only reading sections of Beowulf. And I don't think I've spoiled anything, no spoiler necessary here. The Geats, as I say here, pronounced Geats, not Geats, are worthy and noble people, but have been afflicted of late by a ravenous half-man, half-monster named Grendel, who keeps bursting into the great hall at night, eating soldiers, thanes. A young man named Beowulf, you can tell I did this quickly, sorry about that. And a young man named Beowulf from a neighboring nation seeks to prove his mettle. Hearing word of Grendel, he and his thanes voyage by sea to offer Hrothgar, king of the Geats, his services. Beowulf boasts of his prowess. The Geats are happy because they have a hero whom they hope will kill Grendel. And they have a giant party in Heorot. They drink a lot of mead, which is a form of beer fermented by honey. They get drunk. They have a great feast in the great hall. And hall comes from the Old English word heal, H-E-A-L-L. And then from there, the poem, the epic, recounts Beowulf's exploits and feats. And in the event you haven't read it, I won't say anything else. Last slide. A few things to keep your eye on. One, the alliterative tradition, which we discussed last week. Imagery, even though it's what we might call a heavily masculine poem, the poet really focuses a lot on beautiful imagery, whether it be the imagery of the seacoast, the jewelry, what people wear, Queen Wealhtheow, Hrothgar's wife. Keep an eye on imagery. It's a really stunning poem in that respect. And of course, metaphor. We discussed kinnings last week, but keep your eye out for kinnings such as Whale's Way, which is a metaphor for the ocean. Look for the celebration of the hero and the heroic code. Some of you may find yourselves annoyed with Beowulf because he boasts so much. You and I have been taught that it's impolite to boast, to brag about yourself. Not so in the Anglo-Saxon tradition. That, in fact, is expected. So look for the presentation of heroic behavior versus cowardly behavior. You'll encounter, for example, a man in Hrothgar's court named Unferth, and it's sort of Unferth's job to be skeptical about and question Beowulf's worthiness as a hero. Look for a celebration of community, the clan, and belonging. In other words, the Geats and their hall and their welcoming of Beowulf, their hospitality, versus the outsider monster, Grendel and his mother, and how they threaten the community. I encourage you to look closely at the role of Wealhtheow, who's the queen of Heorot. She's Hrothgar's spouse. Weal in Old English means wealth, riches. You see wealth in her name, Wealhtheow. And so keep your eye on her role and function. Notice the emphasis on the importance of the hall, again pronounced heal in Old English, and the rituals of eating, drinking, talking, sleeping. They all sleep in this giant hall. They all sleep together. They're together. They're with each other all of the time. If some of you probably live in a hall at USF. Our class is in Jordan Hall. So this is a really important word in English that has endured the centuries. Look for beautiful descriptions of the land and sea, clothing, physical prowess. Look for these definitions of masculine codes. There aren't many women in Beowulf, as you might expect. Certainly not like the Iliad and the Odyssey. Just a very few. But still, as a literary text, it's worth looking at these masculine codes. Violence, of course, this poem celebrates violence. It doesn't shirk from violence. It's like a Quentin Tarantino movie or a Coen Brothers movie. The violence is almost poetic, and it's sometimes, frankly, oddly comic. And then, of course, boasting. This is a really fun part of the poem. Lots of boasting. So I hope this lecture wasn't too long. It's just a way of introducing you to the epic tradition in Beowulf and offering you a few things to keep your eye on. I look forward to talking with you about the poem when I return.